We have time for some questions. If you raise your hand. In the back, let's start in the back.
Thank you very much for the fascinating set of evidence. I was wondering, two related questions really arise for me. One is the evidence that you developed for India, using the manufacturing sector in particular. Just wondering how generalizable you think those results are going to be, given that the Indian manufacturing sector is extremely unusual for its level of development, a very small manufacturing sector relative to the service sector. And some of the evidence that has emerged on the Indian manufacturing sector suggests that one of the reasons for this is that pricing power in the Indian manufacturing sector is particularly high, suggesting that incumbency develops a lot of advantages for existing manufacturing firms. So that may explain why size is particularly important in the Indian sector and in the Indian manufacturing sector, and raises questions about how generalizable that result is going to be to other developing countries. And I suppose the related question then is, you listed a range of additional factors that may be important, and it struck me that market characteristics didn't really feature there. So does the level of concentration of the sector matter? Does the level of pricing power of incumbents in sectors actually matter? And may that be a determinant of, you know, the survival rate of firms as they try to enter, particularly if they're small?
Should I go ahead? Or? Yeah. Okay. Actually, it asks a very good question about India and the generalizability of the results. We were also concerned about that. So what we did is, which I haven't shown you, we have replicated that work for the 120 countries for which we have data. The figure that I've shown you is remarkably similar in all across the world. So firms that seem to enter small stay small. Firms that enter large stay large. And the differences in their growth rates are not significant. So this is somewhat of a puzzle. It's an interesting puzzle for us. And what we think has to do with, again, if you're following this entrepreneurship literature, there are a number of areas that people have been focusing. One has to do with, for a long time now, the institutional differences. And when I talk about institutional differences, some of the market institutions also are in there. I mean, whether you have a competitive sector or not is an important thing. Whether you prevent entry through very restrictive entry regulations, that's another thing. But whether you do not promote growth because you have various labor restrictions or corruption and so on. So those are all captured in the jargon of institutions. So most of the time we have been working on these institutional differences across the world. But what we're finding now, and I think what the literature is looking at, is this intrinsic factors to the entrepreneur. And to what extent it is the entrepreneur that makes a difference. So in this discussion of gazelles, for example, who are the gazelles? What characteristics do they have? Are they a special species? To some extent in our study, we are trying to capture that by size at birth. Or at least this is what seems to be coming out. And there is much more to look at, obviously, but this is what we think is happening. And it is not only in India. It is all across the world. We see the same pattern emerging.
Up here in the front, please.
Thank you. You mentioned there is just one, or you just mentioned one study which integrates the informal sector. And we all know the informal sector is very important in the developing world. So policy-wise, what can be done to make the informal sector formal? It's about paying taxes, but if you don't want to pay taxes, you don't have access to loans. So that would be an educational way. So it's not about statistics, it's about policies, because informal entrepreneurs, I'm not talking about subsistence firms, are a backbone in many countries. I'm reading a book, it's called Africa, the Bright Continent, because they have bright sites especially when you talk about the informal economy? Thank you.
First of all, the study I mentioned was putting together informal as well as formal firms in studying the firm life cycle. I think that can be quite misleading because regardless of the fact that informal firms are important and an important share of the economy, the life cycle of firms in the formal and informal sector tends to be very different because for the most part informal firms have a different orientation. Although they may not all be subsistence, a very large proportion of them tend to be subsistence firms. It's more like a complementing your income type of activity as opposed to an activity which is meant to be high growth and employment generating. So when you put everything together and when 80% of the firms are from the informal sector, obviously that sort of dominates the pattern that you see when you look at the firm cycle, and then you could potentially conclude that, well, the firm life cycle in country X or Y is basically downward sloping. That's not generally what we think about as the growth promoting firms in the manufacturing sector. Now, having said that, clearly there is room to look at the informal sector more. There are certain activities that we have in the bank trying to study the informal sector by collecting more data, survey data on the informal sector firms to better understand their impediments and their potential concerns so that one could design policies to address those concerns. But there are a number of interesting randomized experiments that the bank has been doing more recently too, trying to understand whether sort of the informal firms are driving benefits from actually becoming formal. So there are also a large proportion of those that don't necessarily want to be formal because, again, of the orientation. So there is a small proportion of them, as you improve the business environment, will find it more palatable to become formal, or actually they may become employees in formal firms as opposed to sort of opening new formal enterprises themselves. But there's going to be still a very large proportion of the informal firms who are not going to find it desirable from their perspective to become formal because of the nature of the work that they're doing and their objectives.
We'll start with Peter.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Both in your presentation and in your response to the first question, you used the word corruption one time. And it seems that you suggest that it will be an explanatory factor in the final results of the study. Now, my personal observation, both in transition countries and in developing countries, is that the influence of corruption is enormous. And it hampers a normal working of the market because relative prices do no longer reflect relative scarcity, but also corruption. Now, I've done some research myself, but it was extremely difficult to get to grips with it, in the sense that it is hard to measure. We have Transparency International, of course, but showing evidence of a clear relationship, that is something different. What is your expectation of the results of this research? Do you expect that corruption will be clearly a factor that explains part of the results, and are you confident that you will be able to cope with the measurement problem?
Okay. We have been looking at corruption for quite a while now. There is a 2005 JF paper that I published with Torsten Beck and Vojislav Maksimovic, where we tried to explain the firm growth by a number of sort of constraints, and one of those constraints that turn out to be significant is corruption. And indeed, corruption is very difficult to measure, but we use the self-reported sort of constraints to corruption as an indicator there, and it does turn out to be a significant effect that sort of reduces the firm growth. Now, what I think we're trying to do in this study is to look a little bit beyond just firm growth, but to look at it in terms of the life cycle and to see to what extent differences across firm, either employment growth or size or productivity, are going to be determined by different combinations of factors. I am sure there's going to be, as you've seen from the more sort of preliminary sort of variance decomposition results, you're going to find institutions corruption being a main part of how developed institutions are to be an explanatory factor. But I think some of the innovation in this new set of papers is the recognition that firms themselves are different. Despite the fact that they may be operating in different institutional environments, that's not the full story. So even when you look at, for example, institutional differences, you do see that quite a large proportion of firms seem to be growing through their life cycle in institutions that are inferior to U.S. institutions, but that are growing faster than U.S. firms. So there's something else that is there, and that's what we are trying to capture in this new set of findings.
I was wondering whether the effects that you call age effects might really be cohort effects, that initial conditions 20 years ago in an economy may have been different. Could you address that?
We are actually trying to control for those, and there are different methodologies where you could try to address that. It doesn't appear so, but I will give you a final answer later when we have the final draft.
Any other questions? Just one more right back there.
Thank you very much for your speech. And I just wonder about the behind line your presentation, that is enterprise based on micro. My understanding is that macro must be a base for micro, differently from the literature. What is your opinion? One. And second, I have three questions and one is there. And second is the behind, we always must perceive the existence of the market principles. Market principles has two limits. First, that is determined by goods and services vertically. So that is a problem. What do you think of it? The third question is, again, for the market principles. Market principles is instant, in a minute, in a second. While we need product which needs several months or 3 months processing periods we need. What do you think of this? The difference between instant and some periods, that is inevitable results. Thank you.
I think I agree with most of the points you're making. In terms of the micro and macro differences, clearly, I mean, the macro stability issues are important. We do have a line of work in the World Bank trying to understand the impact of macro instability on micro enterprises and small firms, and to what extent potentially insuring them against macro risks may lead to desirable outcomes. And we're doing some randomized experiments having designed macro insurance for micro enterprises, and I suspect we're going to see some impact there. Yeah, firms do take time to adjust to sort of market shocks, and to the extent that the data captures them, I suppose we can analyze them. But this is not what we are doing in these studies that I've discussed.
I think we'd have time for one more question, if there is one. Yes, there is, the lady in the middle.
I think in India, infrastructure is a really bad constraint for many of the firms. And you did not talk much about infrastructure, for example, the reliability of power supply, the kind of transport available, and so on. And I think this kind of factors are also influenced by corruption that you talked about earlier, and also by the size of the firm itself. For example, large firms can have their own power generation facilities, whereas the smaller firms cannot do that. They can build their own access roads. Smaller firms cannot do that. Yeah. And plus also some of the larger firms are producing for the international market, whereas the smaller firms might be producing for the domestic market. Exactly. So how do those factors affect your results?
Yeah. In terms of other constraints, whether it's infrastructure, corruption, we have been looking at all the potential constraints that are identified in these surveys and trying to look at whether they are the determinant or the firm's initial size. And we do find that size trumps all these various factors. That's why, I mean, I've sort of summarized the findings now, but this is another keynote address. The last part of the talk is actually a very long discussion of what we've tried and what we haven't. And what's coming out is that size at birth seems to be trumping all the different constraints that are reported in the surveys, and some of the ones that you mentioned are also in there. You also mentioned something vis-a-vis being able to export and not being able to export, and I think that is coming out in terms of this demand factor that I mentioned. To a large extent, the state's own income seems to have an impact. So I believe that's because this is sort of capturing those firms that do not necessarily are able to go beyond their immediate surroundings, and that's why some of their performance is connected to what is happening in terms of the demand within the state. And I think this is something that we are going to be looking at further in the future.
Well, with that comment, I think it's time to bring our session to a close. Please join me in thanking our president. I just like to sit here and look pretty.
Okay, very good.
Sorry, I should have known that.
Yeah, there's always one more. So if you'd like to stand with me. So.
I love this.
So this is the new style. So Reinhard got the last of the old style. So it says, in appreciation to Asley, President, International Atlantic Economic Society, 2013-2014. And she has this lovely gavel, so she can call meetings to order to her heart's content.
Oh, I'm going to put this to good use in the World Bank.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And I have one other presentation that I think will be a surprise, so excuse me just a moment. So Baklava, would you like to come up here? So I have a lovely plaque here. It says, in appreciation for your years of dedicated service to the International Atlantic Economic Society, Baklava Starzinska, Executive Committee, 2011 through 2014.
Thank you.